Oh, thank you to Dollar Shave Club for sponsoring this video. Go to dollarshaveclub.com/geographics to get your starter set for just $5. Off the northern tip of Scotland lie some of the most important islands in the world. Orkney may not sound like much on paper, a mere 990 square kilometres, home to fewer than 23,000 people. But go looking into its history, and you'll discover a past of unparalleled vitality. 5,000 years ago, a Neolithic culture arose here that was unsurpassed in ancient Europe. Starting in 3600 BC, they raised great henges, built barrows, and created vast temple complexes that could rival anything in Egypt. When they finally vanished, they left behind ruins that were preserved for millennia. The greatest of all these ruins, Skara Brae. An ancient agricultural settlement, Skara Brae spent 43 centuries buried beneath shifting sands. When it was uncovered in 1850, it transformed everything we knew about Scotland's past. So perfectly had this village been frozen in time that seeing it was almost like travelling back to the dawn of civilization. But what really was Skara Brae? Who built it? And how does its story connect to the rest of Neolithic Orkney? Well, join us today as Geographics travels to Britain's far north and uncovers a culture so ancient it makes Stonehenge look practically modern. The fantastically grumpy-looking Scottish poet George Mackay Brown once wrote that the Orkney imagination is haunted by time. He wasn't wrong. Although only separated from Scotland by a mere 10.5 kilometres of sea, the Orkney Archipelago is a place drowning in prehistory. There are so many ancient sites here, over 200 so far discovered, all clustered so close together that it's been called the Egypt of the North. But what are these ancient sites, and how did they all come to be clustered on these remote Scottish islands? Well, we're glad you asked, even though you didn't. I asked, but here we go. Around 3700 BC, the first Neolithic farmers arrived on Orkney, a mere 300 years after the Stone Age reached the British Isles. These first farmers would have come in boats, sailing the treacherous Pentland Firth with pigs, cows, grain, ploughs, and all the other stuff that you need to start an agricultural lifestyle. In Orkney, they found their Garden of Eden. Although the words north of Scotland might conjure images of a place so perpetually cold and wet you might as well rename it Seattle, Orkney's climate is actually rather mild. It was even milder 5,000 years ago, a time when its islands were almost uninhabited. The few Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who'd made it that far were replaced, and Orkney's new farmers quickly settled down to a life of, well, farming. However, first they had to adjust to their new environment. One of the reasons the British Isles have very few remaining Neolithic houses is that they tended to be built of wood. And what does wood do over the course of 5,000 years? Well, it absolutely rots. Luckily for history lovers, though, that wasn't an option on Orkney. At some points in the past, the constant blowing winds left Orkney almost devoid of trees. That meant almost no timber for building, which in turn meant other materials had to be found. The material those long-dead farmers settled on was stone. When they built a structure, they inadvertently built it to last. The first of these long-lasting buildings was the Knap of Howar. An ancient farmhouse, the Knap was first inhabited around 3600 BC. Now, if you've watched our Newgrange video, you might remember that cool bit where we told you how Newgrange was so ancient that the builders of Stonehenge would have found it as old as you find Machu Picchu. But Newgrange itself was built 400 years after the Knap of Howar. Those Stonehenge dudes who felt Newgrange was their Machu Picchu, well, they would have been roughly as distant from the Knap's construction as you are from the founding of the Holy Roman Empire. Over the next few centuries, Orkney's Neolithic culture, it grew increasingly complex. Around 3500 BC, work started on the temple complex known as the Ness of Brodgar. Other sites soon followed. New villages grew up. Then, finally, in 3100 BC, work began on Skara Brae. Construction wasn't like anything we'd consider house building. Rather than being independently standing structures, the entire village was built inside a raised mound known as midden. If that sounds rather pleasant, know that a midden is just a fancy name for a gigantic pile of crap, and we mean that literally, at least in part. Skara Brae's midden was made of dung, compost, random stones, and broken up animal bones. Rather than to just gross people out, though, this was done with a specific purpose: to protect the interlinked houses from the punishing Atlantic winds. So, what was life like inside this pile of prehistoric dung? Well, let's find out. The first thing you need to understand about life in Skara Brae is that it was weirdly close-knit. In this time period, villages weren't much of a thing. Most people lived in separate farmsteads, so the mere fact you had 8 homes clustered together with maybe 50 to 100 residents spread between them would have been impressive. But Skara Brae wasn't just weird conceptually. Were you to visit, you'll discover that there was only one way into the midden, a single, sealable passage that you had to stoop to enter. Once inside, it would have been dark and mighty disorienting. The network of passages connecting the houses was winding and narrow, like an ancient Kowloon-walled city. But once you overcame your nervousness and ventured on, you'd soon discover oases of light. Each branching passage led to separate homes, which would have each been lit by a fireplace. Without windows, these homes would have been dark and smoky, and the single fire casting strange shadows. Stone seats were set up by the hearths, where you might have glimpsed the head of each household watching you pass with an unreadable expression. But while visiting might have been intimidating for the newcomer, those who knew Skara Brae probably found it cozy. Rather than being to confuse visitors, the winding passages were to stop the winds from howling in. Combined with the insulation the midden provided, and the heat from the fires, obviously, the homes were surprisingly warm. They were also big. At 36 square meters, there was enough space for all sorts of extras. There were stone cupboards and stone beds, the latter padded with heather, bracken, and animal skins to make them comfortable. Fish may have hung from the ceiling so the smoke from the fire could cure them. And speaking of the ceilings, they are one part of the home that hasn't survived into modern times. Built of turf, they were probably supported by timber or whalebone. Incredibly, the houses even came with modern amenities. Despite being built so long ago that there's almost no existing comparison point, Skara Brae had rudimentary plumbing and even what appears to be indoor toilets. And do bear in mind that Britain didn't start pooping indoors regularly until the late 19th century, and, well, here we have a bunch of ancient farmers inventing it like it's no big deal. Outside the individual homes, there are signs that life in Skara Brae may have been community-based. Archaeologists have noted that the fittings and sizes of the dwellings are more or less the same, with nothing that looks like a chief's home. As a result, it's thought that Skara Brae was a relatively equal society, although maybe not quite a socialist utopia. We know, for example, that most of the stone dressers had secret compartments where things presumably were kept that the families didn't want their neighbours to see. There's also the mystery of House 7. Unlike Skara Brae's other homes, House 7 has a door that could only be sealed from the outside. So what sort of building needs a door that the occupants can't open at will? Well, the obvious answer would be a jail, but we don't know that for sure. It could be that important rituals took place in House 7, maybe to do with growing up or with death or even with childbirth. One last intriguing thing about Skara Brae is that it never experienced warfare. No weapons have ever been uncovered here, no signs that the inhabitants feared their neighbours. But that doesn't mean everything was hunky-dory. But you know what will be hunky-dory? Your shaving situation with today's sponsor, Dollar Shave Club. Dollar Shave Club covers all of your grooming needs. Shower, oral care, deodorants, and most importantly, shaving. Now, obviously, I don't shave my beard, but I do shave my head, and that experience has just become so much better since switching to Dollar Shave Club and using their high-quality blades. Look at those things. There's 5 of them on there. Is it 6? It's 6! There's 6 of them on there! Now, Dollar Shave Club sent me their ultimate shave starter set. Obviously, we got the razor and the blades, and by the way, this feels really good. That's a heavy handle, excellent for control. Also, there's these guys. What you do is you start with the prep scrub, that's for before, then you move on to the shave butter, which you use during, obviously, and then you use the post-shave dew. Now, I've mentioned that this stuff right here is my favourite. My scalp, as I said before in these ads, gets a little bit dry, so slapping some of that on afterwards certainly helps. So, definitely visit dollarshaveclub.com/geographics and get this Ultimate Shave starter set for only $5. And why not round out your grooming routine by adding any of their other high-quality products? After that, the restock box ships full-size products at the regular price. Again, dollarshaveclub.com/geographics. Just go do it! And let's get back to the video. With all this communal living and neighbourly love, it can be tempting to see Skara Brae as an ancient paradise. One, it'd be great fun to get blasted back in time to Outlander style. But no, while Skara Brae might have had its upsides, it would still suck for anyone used to non-Stone Age living. Thanks to the bones we've recovered, we know that villagers often suffered painful arthritis or even had skulls that became grooved by lugging baskets around using their heads. Then there was the miserably low life expectancy. The majority of people living in Neolithic Orkney died in their 30s. A huge proportion died even earlier in childhood. Getting to the age of 50 was as impressive as reaching 100 today. So while we're going to keep coming back to what a complex, vibrant culture Skara Brae and Orkney's Neolithic residents enjoyed, don't make the mistake of thinking you'd find it anything but short, miserable, and agonizing. Still, if you were going to get outlandered back to the Neolithic era, Skara Brae would probably be the best of a bad bunch. Its inhabitants had leisure time for starters, as evidenced by the art we found, something you tend not to bother with if you're struggling to merely stay alive. Their diet, too, was remarkably varied. There's evidence these guys not only ate the cattle and sheep they reared, but also seals, goats, red deer, and possibly even the odd beached whale. The crops they grew also returned good yields. We can guess this because they were some of the first farmers in Europe to use manure as fertilizer. On top of that, there was the shellfish in the nearby sea and limpets that they cultivated in special waterproof tanks built into their houses. Skara Brae, then, was a village in decent shape, a place any Neolithic farmer would be happy to call home, even if it meant living in the remote north of the British Isles. Well, in the north at least. Despite how we may think of the Orkneys today, remote probably wasn't an accurate descriptor in Skara Brae's time. If anything, the place was almost crowded. It's been estimated that there were 10,000 people living on Neolithic Orkney, a huge number in an era when villages of 100 people were unusual. And that's not even including the visitors. Over the centuries, pottery styles and types of monuments that originated on Orkney have been found across the whole of Britain. In other words, Skara Brae was less the arse end of nowhere than it was the suburb of Neolithic Paris, a place everyone was looking to for inspiration. It's even thought that it was on this archipelago that henges originated. Now, if you're thinking, wait a minute, what is a henge? Well, you already know the most famous example. Stonehenge wasn't just built after Orkney's monuments. It was probably inspired by them. So yes, sorry about that, Scotland. You guys go and invent henges, but now the whole world thinks us English were the ones responsible. Speaking of henges, it's time we talked about the most impressive aspect of Skara Brae. Not the village itself, but what the villagers were likely involved in. It's time to talk about Orkney's megastructures. In 1999, UNESCO designated Skara Brae part of a World Heritage Site called Heart of Neolithic Orkney, and yes, we absolutely ripped that off for this video's title. Although Skara Brae is part of the site, its boundaries extend much further, covering a whole swath of monuments within 10 kilometers of the village. That's because, as impressive as Skara Brae is, it wasn't just a Neolithic village surrounded by grasslands. It was on the fringes of some of the greatest Stone Age building projects ever undertaken. But before we visit those, just a quick note. Throughout this video, we've been using a lot of words indicating probability, words like probably, presumably, likely, we assume that, and so on. This is because the people at Skara Brae left behind no records. We don't even know what they called their village. Skara Brae is a mid-20th century corruption of an old Orkney word. Over the next couple of minutes, that vagueness is only going to increase as we just tiptoe into speculation. But please do be assured that this speculation is from actual archaeologists and not just our writing team simply getting their pet monkey to throw darts at random words taped to a board. Disclaimer over, we can start with the biggest speculation of all, that the residents of Skara Brae helped build these megastructures. The magnificent Stenness stone circle, for example, has been dated to around 3000 BC, a century after Skara Brae was built. Although the circle stands over 10 kilometers from the village, identical grooved ware pottery has been found at both sites, indicating a connection. There's also the sheer size of it. The circle is so big there's simply no way a single village could have built it. It seems more likely it was a team project involving villagers from all across this corner of Orkney. The same goes for Maeshowe. A gigantic cairn constructed around 2800 BC, Maeshowe is perfectly aligned to the winter solstice, allowing the sun's weak rays to penetrate its entrance once every year. Yet the greatest megastructure of all predates Skara Brae by centuries. A mere 100 years after the Knap of Howar was built, remember that? The place even Newgrange's builders were like, damn, that's old. Orkney's residents got started on their masterpiece, the Knap of Howar. Only discovered in 2002, the Knap of Howar is one of the single most important archaeological finds in Scottish history. Apparently a temple complex that lay a short walk from Skara Brae, protected from the elements by great walls 4 meters high. Individual temples were crammed together at the site. In its heyday, it must have looked like a scaled-down version of Mecca. We can only speculate on how this vast complex would have appeared to the farmers of Skara Brae. Seen from afar, these monuments would have dominated the landscape. Did they inspire fear, hope, feelings of piety? Obviously, we just have no way of knowing. All we know is that these monuments, all visible from Skara Brae, must have held tremendous importance to its inhabitants. For 500 years, they existed together, enough time for generation upon generation of villagers to grow up, get old, and die, comforted by the knowledge that even after they were gone, their culture would survive. And it did. At least for a while. But the iron law of the universe is that everything dies. When the end came to Orkney, it would be spectacular. When Armageddon reached Orkney, it came not in the form of tragedy, but in the form of a party. By then, Skara Brae was already long gone, vanished into history. Despite what you may have heard, Skara Brae didn't end in cataclysm. Instead, it seems to have been slowly abandoned over centuries, before at last being forgotten altogether. The likely trigger for this? Well, all those damn megastructures. When Skara Brae was first built, the social model was based around hyper-local communities, often no bigger than a single village. But the construction of the grand monuments was such a massive undertaking that it must have involved some regional organizing body. The theory is that Skara Brae appeared at a time when this authority was slowly coalescing. This would explain the lack of violence, the neighborly vibes. It might also explain Skara Brae's abandonment. Perhaps as the decades marched on, Skara Brae's residents began to identify less with their village and more with their wider culture. Maybe it began to feel as if you could move across the islands without leaving home. Maybe opportunities began to arise elsewhere. It could be that Skara Brae suffered the fate of so many depressed small towns today, all the young folk moving away until there's nothing left but the elderly and their memories. Finally, even they disappeared. Throughout its existence, sand had been a fact of life in Skara Brae. It blew across the midden on windy days, likely crept its way into the passageways, requiring plenty of work to sweep it back out. With everyone gone, the sand was finally free to claim its prize, free to slowly bury the village. Skara Brae disappeared around 2500 BC after 6 centuries of continuous occupation. At the moment it was abandoned, Stonehenge was still under construction. The pyramids were just about to start taking shape. But even as greater monuments rose in England and Egypt, the last traces of Orkney's Neolithic masters were being swept away. About 200 years after Skara Brae was buried, the gigantic temple complex at the Knap of Howar met its fate. On one random weird day lost to history, some 400 cattle were driven into the temple and slaughtered all at once. They were then cooked and eaten in a gargantuan feast, the likes of which the British Isles had probably never seen. Thousands of people would have been able to take part. Once the cattle had all been eaten, the feast-goers took their tools and smashed their temple to pieces. We don't know how long it took to destroy the work of 1200 years, don't know how it felt to these people to symbolically tear down a building as ancient to them as the oldest cathedrals of Europe are to us. Once the temples were in ruins, the bones of the cattle were piled up in mounds upon which deer carcasses were draped. A single cattle skull was carefully placed in the center of it all. And then they buried the ruined temple, shoveling rubble atop the ruins until they were lost to history. It was the final weird end of Neolithic Orkney. After that, the focal point of British Isles culture would shift south to the mainland. But while Skara Brae would be forgotten for a long time, it would return. There's simply no way such spectacular remains could be lost forever. It's hard to grasp just how impossibly long Skara Brae lay hidden by the sand. 43 centuries ticked by before it was rediscovered, a passage of time almost beyond comprehension. Think back to 1920. See how delightfully old-fashioned it is, with all those flapper girls dancing to jazz and everything looking like a silent film. Well, now try picturing 1820. How weird is it to imagine a world where Napoleon is still alive, wars are fought on horses, and nobody has ever heard of Abraham Lincoln? It's possible you've managed that. Okay, well now try imagining 1720. We're guessing it's just too alien for you, too far back to conjure anything except vague images of dudes in powdered wigs. That's only 3 centuries ago, and it's already so distant your mind can't forge a meaningful connection with it. And you still need to repeat that process 40 more times, adding a single century each time to get a sense of how long Skara Brae spent buried. But while 43 centuries is a stupidly long time, it's still just the blink of an eye to eternity. That eons-long blink finally ended in the winter of 1850. That year, the storm of the century lashed Orkney. Winds battered the islands, tearing sand away from a large mound known as Skara Brae. When the gale finally ceased, the local laird William Watt of Skaill was astonished to see traces of ancient stone walls sticking out of the sand. It was the beginning of a long process of rediscovery. Thanks to the cocoon of sand and the fact that everything was made of stone, the houses at Skara Brae had been almost perfectly preserved. The first 4 were excavated in the aftermath of the storm, although the remaining homes weren't brought to light until 1927. At first, everyone was like, oh, that's pretty cool. I mean, what's it from? Some Iron Age settlement from around 500 BC? Well, it wasn't until the early 1970s that radiocarbon dating was conducted and the world realized just how impossibly ancient the settlement was. Today, Skara Brae is widely acknowledged as one of the best Neolithic sites, not just in the British Isles, but in the whole of Europe. Almost nowhere else on the continent does such a complete ruins exist. Taken alongside the other treasures of Orkney, it constitutes a site easily as important as Stonehenge. But great as those other sites are, in some ways, Skara Brae may be even more interesting. While other cairns and henges exist, Skara Brae is unique in that it's not an ancient megastructure, but simply a small village, preserved exactly as it was when Stone Age farmers lived there. Looking down into its rooms, still complete with their stone furniture, it's possible for a moment to almost feel what life might have been like for those who lived and died here, to picture their daily lives, to sense what made them tick. With a channel like this, we usually focus on the big stuff, the places that made history or where something extraordinary happened. But Skara Brae shows that you don't need to look at the big stuff to be overawed by the past. Sometimes just catching a glimpse of an ordinary person's life is interesting enough. The ancient culture that built Skara Brae may be long dead, but by looking back at the traces of their lives, we can see that they weren't all that different to us, that despite the centuries separating us, they were human too. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash that like button below and don't forget to subscribe. Also, why not check out our fantastic sponsor for this episode, Dollar Shave Club? Go do that right now. There is a link below, and thank you for watching.